I want to just begin by expressing my thanks to Lambert, who invited me, and to all of you, to the ICS team, for including me in what's been a really stimulating engagement with ideas that I care very much about. And I've found it both inspiring and very instructive. I think that the conference, like the work that ICS has been doing, is really remarkable in engaging discussion across academic disciplines, across faith communities, and also bridging what sometimes feels like a great divide between academics and practitioners. So these are all causes to which I am also committed, and I really value the opportunity to speak with you today. I've been reading some of the posts on the ICS blog that I gather Allison has got going, Ground Motive, which I really recommend to you if you haven't had a look at it yet. And so I want to begin by picking up a theme and a rich exchange between Allison and Bob in particular on recent tragedies and injustices, including the Trayvon Martin shooting. The question they're exploring is both the simplest and the most difficult we can ask when we are confronting the legion injustices we see unfolding around us. What can we do? The question is as urgent whether the we in question is scholars, community leaders, professional practitioners, citizens, or activists, or whether that we comprises all of these. As Allison and Bob explored the question, it was with a particular emphasis on, or particular worry about the role of philosophers or theorists. Bob framed the question this way, quote, "If our conceptual analyses are merely reflective of what is, and never transformative, or at least potentially transformative, what good are we, academics, philosophers, theorists?" I think this question is critically important for all of us, though, for we can't act in the world without a guiding framework of ideas, whether or not we're conscious of the action guiding frameworks we're relying on, and whether or not we're reflectively critical about them. But the subtext of this exceedingly thoughtful and thought-provoking exchange, if I read it correctly, was that the conceptual languages of human rights and social justice that we have in our philosophical toolbox don't always seem adequate in the present moment to render coherent our widespread intuitions about the forms of injustice and the human rights failures we see unfolding all around us. It's not that we don't have philosophical accounts of human rights and social justice. We have plenty. The question is how to link them up to the world of practice in a way that makes coherent sense of our often conflicting intuitions about what the practical content of human rights and social justice should be for this strange world that we now inhabit. So in this talk, I'm going to offer some critical reflections on some of the frameworks through which some influential philosophers have made sense of human rights and social justice and of how these fit together. The nutshell summary of this view, which somewhat contentiously I'm going to call the standard view, and of which I take John Rawls as an exemplary but by no means a solitary representative, is that human rights are universal and social justice is contextual. For the sake of simplicity, again, I'm just going to call this the standard view. The various phenomena we cluster under the heading of globalization, though, complicate this account, this standard view. And I'll briefly review some prominent critiques of that view that focus on its rootedness in a Westphalian model of the international order, that is, a system of states in which sovereign, territorially bounded states are the most important actors in the international system, and that they argue that this is no longer adequate to the historical moment we're in. I think these are forceful criticisms of the standard view, but I also want to highlight a different way in which globalization complicates that view. I want to suggest that the circumstances of globalization occasion a reversal in the way we might think about the relationship between human rights and universalism, and between social justice and contextualism. Finally, I'll suggest some ways in which this rethinking of the relationship and of theoretical views might help us to see just a bit more clearly how we can understand the individual actions we take as fitting within a multi-scale, dynamic, global, and democratic division of labor, as we each try to make our own large or small contributions to advancing human rights and social justice. Now, okay, PowerPoint's not usually my thing, but the spatial features of the argument lent itself to PowerPoint this time. So what I'm calling the standard view accustoms us to thinking of human rights as universal, both in their content and in their application, and to think of social justice as contextual, as an ideal whose practical content cannot be specified except within a given social political order. Human rights, that is, are the forms of respect that are owed to human beings as such, without qualification. They're therefore universal in scope, encompassing every member of humanity. And they're universal in their philosophical foundations, appealing to qualities shared by human beings that renders every person a worthy object of equal dignity, concern, and respect. Of course, there are differing accounts of what those foundations are. The dignity of our rational nature, perhaps, as for Kantian views, or our common vulnerability to suffering, as for utilitarians, or our common origin as the creation of, quoting Jefferson here, nature or nature's God for natural rights theorists, or our common capacity for flourishing and self-development as for capabilities theorists such as Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. But for each of these views, the logical structure of the claim to human rights is the same. There are qualities in virtue of which every human being should be treated as a bearer of equal moral worth. They are also ideally universal in their realization and enforcement, an aspiration which has yet to be realized, but which lies at the heart of the human rights instruments in international and cosmopolitan law, beginning with the Universal Declaration. In principle, the universality of human rights and their correlative obligations stands as an outer constraint or limit on the other rights, obligations, opportunities, and interests we may permissibly pursue, that ring fence that Professor Walterstorff talked about yesterday. Above all, they stand as limits on what states, those entities that, as Max Weber famously put it, have monopoly control over the legitimate use of violence. So there are limits on what states may permissibly do to advance their national interests both within and beyond their borders. But also, and increasingly, there are standards which not only states and their officials, but also non-state actors, such as multinational corporations, are held to account. Something, Lowell Ewart referred to in his presentation yesterday. In principle, that is, they are binding on all human agents, individual or collective, as duties they owe to each and every member of humanity. Not that there aren't ambiguities and endless debates about what those duties actually entail. Some lists of human rights are expansive, including the Universal Declaration. Others are minimalist. Some argue that the only credible enumeration of human rights will limit them to negative rights, rights against torture and other violations of a person's bodily integrity, rights against restrictions on the most fundamental liberties of conscience, expression, and movement. Others argue that any respect-worthy list of human rights must include, at minimum, a positive right to subsistence. And here I'm thinking especially of Henry Shu's work on basic rights, since subsistence is just as much a condition for the enjoyment of any other right as the physical security of the person. Casting human rights as universal expresses their dual character as moral commands and as legal rules. As moral commands, they prescribe absolute requirements for human conduct, overriding any competing basis for action, however worthy, trumps, as Ronald Dworkin put it. As legal rules, they justify, sometimes at the limit, the use of coercive power to protect and enforce them. This generates the paradox that Hannah Arendt famously noted, that to be practical as effective limits on what states and others may do, human rights need to, human rights need to be institutionalized within states. So where states are the sole possessor of the legitimate use of violence, this creates the problem that the universally valid rights can have practical effect only if they're recognized and protected from within the legal order of a state. For those who are stateless and therefore lack the capacity to claim the protection of a particular state, human rights are empty words. The most basic human right, Arendt argued, is the right to have rights, that is, the right to be a member within a rights-respecting political order. That paradox may, which I think remains, if we look at the plight of refugees and other stateless persons around the world, it remains a challenge. It may be overcome gradually with an emerging order of cosmopolitan law institutionalized in international courts, such as the ICC, as we heard about yesterday. It may also be rebalanced if the international community were able to generate legitimate mechanisms for establishing military forces capable of enforcing, sorry, my text is, I lost my text here. For establishing military forces capable of realizing a global responsibility to protect individuals against gross human rights violations through humanitarian interventions. But we're very far from establishing such mechanisms, as Romeo Dallaire's work makes tragically evident. In any case, the key point here is really not whether it's possible to imagine effective and legitimate international institutions for protecting human rights, but rather that the core logic of human rights as moral commands that are given practical reality through enforceable legal rules remains the same. And it's deeply connected to the core idea that human rights have universal moral validity and should have universal legal reality, whether enforced by states, transnational bodies, or global institutions. So much then for a kind of sweep through what I take to be a common, prominent reading of human rights as universals. Now let's turn to what I believe to be an equally prominent view or dominant view, that the practical content of social justice can only be understood contextually. That is, by reference to a particular bounded political community. In contrast to human rights, where we owe duties to one another by virtue of our common humanity, social justice concerns the obligations we have toward others by virtue of the relationships we have with them in a common social order. There are two broad versions of this view. The first, again most familiar through the work of John Rawls, is that duties of justice arise out of our participation in an ongoing scheme of social cooperation that exists before we are born and will continue after we die. It's the structural features of this scheme of cooperation that play the most important role in determining the life chances of each individual to live a full, flourishing, and complete life. The scheme or system of cooperation, which Rawls calls the basic structure of society, includes all those social and political institutions that, taken together, generate the set of opportunities individuals have to develop and exercise their natural talents and to live a full life. The political constitution, and the legal system, the economy, the system of education and healthcare, and the family. The principles of justice, then, should aim at regulating this basic structure so that it generates fair outcomes, those that treat members as free and equal over time. This view is commonly called an institutionalist account of justice for two reasons. First, because it understands institutionalized relationships between individuals as that which needs to be regulated in order for outcomes to be just. And second, because it requires an overarching institutional order which is capable of settling and enforcing the rules and regulations that will generate just outcomes. And in most views, that means the state. So the second broad reading of social justice as contextual concerns the substantive norms that inform citizens' judgments about what justice is. Michael Walzer, David Miller, Michael Sandel are thinkers who agree generally on this way of thinking about justice. The core idea is that the judgments that we have about what justice is arise out of a common ethical life, a moral community, which again is historically situated. So this shared, this sense of a political community that's also a shared ethical community makes social justice possible in two ways. First, the shared ethical community underwrites our substantive judgments about justice and injustice. And second, a shared sense of community is what makes us willing to make the sacrifices that social justice requires. The first point is especially strong in Michael Walzer's work, the second in David Miller's. So anyway, the idea that human rights are universal and social justice is contextual fits really comfortably within the Westphalian frame, that international order is best understood as a system of states regulated by a very thin moral order of international law that includes human rights but also respects the autonomy and the internal sovereignty of states. And the moral significance of state sovereignty is that it gives states the powers they need to regulate their own internal economies and social orders and realize their responsibilities for achieving justice on terms that are worked out in accordance with the society's distinctive ethical traditions and moral self-understandings. As many critics have noted, the standard view doesn't fit so well with, it may fit well with Westphalianism, but we no longer live in a Westphalian global order, they argue. It doesn't, so that under the circumstances of economic globalization, there are problems with this model. First, it doesn't acknowledge that states are not equally powerful in driving the formation of international law or defining the policies of extremely powerful economic institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Powerful states are able to call the shots and skew the outcomes to advantage themselves and the economic elites to whom they're beholden. In the name of free trade and economic development, they've unleashed a form of what many call global neoliberal capitalism, which, while generating unprecedented levels of economic growth, has also generated domestic inequality on a scale that we haven't seen since the robber baron days, and also a form of global inequality that some characterize as a kind of neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. So in any case, economic globalization is also driving a process of natural resource extraction and exploitation that's causing untold environmental devastation throughout the planet, which generates its own human rights and social justice concerns. So these criticisms are leveled at the construction both of human rights and of responsibility for social justice as represented in what I've called the standard view. When it comes to human rights and human rights universalism, the criticisms focus on the argument that a universalistic account of human rights necessitates a minimalist reading of human rights. The logic of that argument goes something like this. Because there are deep disagreements about the moral foundations of human rights, it's difficult, if not impossible, to get universal agreement on the practical content of rights that are going to be then enforceable under international law. So if we want human rights to be effective legal instruments, then a minimalist reading of those rights is, as Michael Ignatieff puts it, the most we can hope for. So in practice, critics argue human rights minimalism has reinforced existing structures of power in three ways. First, when it comes to the enforcement of rights against egregious violations of the security of the person through military interventions, human rights have been invoked selectively and opportunistically in a way that serves the military and economic interests of global powers, especially the United States. the usual target of this line of criticism. Since the national interests of the United States and also European powers would not have been served through an intervention in Rwanda, for example, or in Darfur, there are no interventions to stop genocides there. But the U.S. invoked human rights to stop, in trying to legitimize its military actions in Afghanistan and in Iraq, to protect women from the Taliban, to protect the Kurds from Saddam Hussein. And so this selective use of human rights arguments in ways that seem to reinforce existing structures of power in the global system leads some to view human rights language as deeply hypocritical in the way it actually operates in our political discourses. Second, the minimalist reading of human rights privileges rights of physical security, civil rights, some political rights, at the expense of social and economic rights. And especially when this kind of negative reading, this negative thin reading of human rights is combined with the policies that are advanced by the IMF and the World Bank, for example, structural adjustment, so on, what James Tully calls also the right of commerce, the right of corporations to enter into commercial actions in other countries, a right which is protected through these instruments, have led to an international order which privileges the economic interests of the industrialized North and enables the continued economic domination of the global South, that is, the former colonies of the North, which is why people sometimes characterize this as a form of neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. Third, these two dynamics of human rights discourse have, as I said, generated a sense that human rights language is hypocritical, generated what we might call a hermeneutics of suspicion toward human rights among people in the non-West, who often characterize human rights as a form of cultural imperialism. Sometimes this suspicion toward human rights is mobilized opportunistically. We have to be as suspicious of the mobilization of this cultural imperialist argument as we are in the other direction sometimes, because elites in the non-West will mobilize this argument in order to defend themselves against rights claims from their own people. We saw this in the Asian values debates in the 1990s, where Lee Kuan Yew was advancing this argument to defend against civil and political liberties in Singapore, and we see it very commonly among African elites in trying to push back against claims for women's rights. But it doesn't help when Western actors use human rights language to characterize non-Western cultures as barbaric. And themselves as the bearers of the standards of civilization, that is, of human rights, which unfortunately we commonly find in public discourse. When it's used that way, human rights is at risk of being viewed as a new mission civilisatrice, in which, as Gayatri Spivak, the post-colonial feminist theorist, bitingly puts it, positions white men, sometimes white women, to protect brown women against brown men. Sorry, white men protect brown women against brown men. A dynamic we see at work, I think, quite clearly in things such as the burqa ban in France. Other lines of criticism focus on the inadequacy of the standard view when it comes to social justice. Philosophers such as Thomas Pogge and Alan Buchanan have argued that the view that states are responsible for the distribution of opportunities within their borders is just out of step with the economic realities of the current global system, and it understates the institutional capacities that we have or could achieve to bring about greater social justice on a global scale. The globalization of capitalism, they argue, not only generates extreme poverty in the global South and extreme inequality along the North-South divide, but it's underwritten by powerful states' control over the steering mechanisms of the international order, including the World Bank and the IMF. So there's a continuity with the earlier critiques of rights. It's also underwritten, though, by the rights of states within the international order, the rights of sovereignty. And Poge emphasizes the international borrowing privilege, the power of states to borrow money on the account of their people, and also the international resource privilege, which empowers states to allow outside developers to come in and buy their natural resources. And these two privileges of states, he argues, actually fuel corruption in developing countries because it gives elites an incentive to grab power and take the money and run. And so Poge's basic argument is that, and Buchanan as well, is that, and kind of building on the Rawlsian idea that the principles of justice should regulate our relationships as embedded in a common basic structure, they kind of agree with that, but say that there is now a global basic structure constituted through these institutions and laws, and therefore that we have duties of social justice on a global scale that derive from our enmeshment in that global structure, and duties that weigh most heavily on those of us who are citizens within wealthy states that have benefited from this order. So the basic idea of all of these lines of arguments is that there are problems with the standard view in that it might sound nice in theory, but the way it's played out has actually worked to generate greater forms of human vulnerability that ideas of human rights and social justice are meant to prevent or protect against. Now, it's important to note that the scholars who criticize the standard view of human rights and social justice because of its incapacity to come to terms with these international institutional structures aren't actually challenging this association between human rights and universalism and social justice and contextualism. They're still affirming a universalistic account of human rights, but saying that that account needs to be thicker, needs to include social and economic rights, for example. They're still arguing that social justice is contextual. It's just that the context now, we need to understand that context on a global scale, and that's the institutionalist argument. So in any case, I think these criticisms of the standard view are potent in many ways, and we have to engage with them. But what I want to do in the next part of the talk is to focus on a different implication of globalization for the way we think about human rights and social justice. I want to suggest that globalization presses us to reverse the polarities between human rights and social justice on the one hand, and universalism and contextualism on the other. That is, that we need to also think about human rights as contextual and social justice as universal. In making this move, I'm suggesting another move as well, a shift in perspective from that of the philosopher or legislator to that of the citizen or the practitioner or the activist. From the philosopher's perspective, the investigation of fundamental principles such as rights or justice is an exercise in practical reason, an effort to answer the question of what I or we ought to do. The philosophical work in addressing this task involves clarification of core concepts and the development of a logical account of the relationship between them, as well as an account that meets the tests of moral justification and is sufficiently precise to be action guiding. That's the practical part of the practical reason. This sort of inquiry may be generated in the first instance by an actually existing problem of justice, and I think actually our greatest theories of justice often are animated by contemporary injustices. But it doesn't limit itself to thinking through the constraints of a particular problem situation. To do that would be to reduce the question of what we ought to do or what we can't to what we can do or be as things stand now. And so here I'm taking, again, Rawls as an exemplar, and particularly his account of the task of the philosopher, the political philosopher, in terms of ideal theory, which Dr. Wolterstorff mentioned yesterday, what Rawls calls realistic utopia, following Rousseau's dictum that we should take men as they are, maybe women too, and laws as they can be. Or if you prefer, we can turn to Kant and his poetically succinct statement of the three questions he asked himself in all of his philosophical work. What can I know? What must I do? What may I hope? So that's the philosopher's perspective, and obviously it's a very potent perspective. It's a crucial perspective. But the citizen's perspective is a bit different. For her, the starting point is the intuition that something in the world is not as it should be, and that action is needed in order to bring something else about. But this intuition may not come ready packaged with a language of political discourse through which to bring about the transformation that seems necessary. For the citizen, the key question is, what can I do with these words, human rights, social justice, to bring about the change I believe we need to see in the world? The challenge of choosing which language to use when trying to bring about real transformation is all the more daunting because so often the language of justice that we have in hand, in our pockets, the language that circulates in our public discourse and in our inner conversations with ourselves, is language we've inherited. And sometimes we sit uneasily with that language because of the sense that it confirms, sometimes in ways we can't quite put our finger on, Thrasymachus' dictum, that justice is the interest of the stronger. That's why we regard as heroic figures those who created new words and deeds through which to express and hence to claim for ourselves hitherto uncrystallized notions about justice. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream, or satyagraha. So when we take up the citizen's perspective on human rights and social justice, the question becomes, how do people use these concepts and maybe other concepts on the ground in order to transform actually existing social structures and relationships that fail to respect the equal dignity or moral worth of some class of people? What we find is that although citizens do use the terms human rights and social justice in ways that philosophers would recommend to address claims against the state or against international institutions, they also use these and other discourses in very innovative ways. The global diffusion of human rights discourse takes root at ground level, not simply or even primarily through the legislative enactment of universalistic constructions of rights, backed by the coercive power of the state, but through the creative translation of the principle of equal dignity into a moral language that has resonance within the web of meanings through which people create and sustain their communities. This work of translation entails claiming agency not only to assert rights, but also to define their practical content through negotiations with other social actors. These negotiations often take place far from the view of the state. In her work on everyday feminism, for example, political theorist Jane Mansbridge shows how women in low-income urban neighborhoods in the U.S. use the language of women's rights and of the women's rights movement to shift the power dynamics within their very local domestic relationships. Another example is a local minister in Bolivia who routinely delivers a lecture on women's rights every time he presides over a marriage ceremony. Another example is the transnational organization, Women Living Under Muslim Law, which works on reviving the tradition of ijtihad in Islamic teachings, the right of every believer. We heard yesterday about the idea that in Islam, every believer has a direct connection to God, and that also is a direct connection to the Quran, a right of every believer to read and interpret the Quran. And so women are reviving this tradition to push against the power of the imams and to reread the Quran and the Hadith in terms that are more open to ideas of gender equality. Another example, perhaps a more extreme example, is the Zapatistas, who, under the banner of human rights of indigenous peoples, assert their entitlement to protect human rights within their communities and deny the legitimate authority of the state to define and enforce human rights. So to understand the ways in which human rights become practically effective as resources for protecting against human vulnerability, we need to understand how, as legal anthropologist Sally Mary puts it, human rights are remade in the vernacular. Mary emphasizes that this work of vernacularization is neither simply a local or a global affair. The diffusion and translation of norms of respect for human dignity involves agents at different scales, those operating primarily at the global scale and upholding human rights as an internationally recognized standards, those operating primarily at ground level to resist highly localized forms of domination, and those who move in between these levels, acting as what she calls translators between universalistic principles and localized norms. And I think that the work that Pamela Couture was describing yesterday is this kind of work of translation. The work of translation takes courage as it renders agents vulnerable to criticism from both directions, as relativists who compromise the value and meaning of human rights, or as traitors to their communities. Nor are they always successful. Sometimes their efforts at translation fall flat, especially when they get successfully characterized as moralizing protagonists for Western norms, or as apologists for patriarchal cultures. And again, this can also get they can also get co-opted by political elites who use them to legitimate their power while also subverting or obstructing emancipatory goals. The sort of token feminist whom authorities march out, or the token minority member whom authorities march out to. In some cases, struggles for the practical realization of human rights are best advanced, in fact, without using the language of human rights at all. In northern Nigeria, for example, where some women didn't seek essential medical care because of norms against leaving the house without a husband's or a father's permission, local activists focused on teaching girls that under Sharia principles, they have a right to leave the house without permission in these circumstances. A particularly powerful example of approaches that avoid talk of human rights while achieving tremendous gains for women's well-being and against women's vulnerability is ongoing work on ending the practice of female genital cutting in Africa, and particularly in Senegal. Gerald Mackey is a political scientist, a rather geeky political scientist who focuses on rational choice theory and who was possessed of the urgency of this issue. And for decades there had been human rights activists, women's activists, feminist activists, saying that women, this is a violation of these girls' human rights, this practice. And they got funding from the UN, and it got nowhere. It really didn't make a big difference in changing the practice because it was a kind of moralizing language from above. So Jerry Mackey went and he studied the history of transformations in practices that are harmful to women and looked to Chinese foot binding and found that what actually worked the change in the Chinese foot binding case wasn't legislation. It was a formation of community level, village level pledge associations in which the community by community, parents would pledge not to bind their daughters' feet. Why was this necessary? Well, because it was a collective action problem in rational choice terms. That is, that in order for daughters to be marriageable, they had to undergo these procedures, foot binding, genital cutting. And if one family, out of concern for the daughter's well-being, prevented her, didn't have her undergo that procedure, they would disadvantage her for life because she wouldn't be able to marry and she'd have no means of subsistence. And so it was actually out of concern for their daughter's welfare that they submitted the daughters to this practice. So Mackey's taking a kind of social contract view, kind of think about the Hobbesian social contract. Everyone needs to lay down their arms simultaneously in order for the contract to take place. said that this is called as a convention model of social change, has worked with local facilitators to create village-level deliberations. And they go village by village by village and get all the parents to sign on simultaneously to an agreement not to do this to their daughters. And it's working. It's actually changing the practice remarkably effectively, and it continues. But they never whisper the words women's rights, human rights, when they do this. So what's telling about it, I think, apart from its ingenious use of rational choice theory, which I'm not generally a great admirer, is that it steers clear of this moralizing language and avoids that line of criticism of human rights talk. But also that it recognizes that in order to take root, we need to values or principles of respecting human dignity need to be integrated into the deeper structure of social meanings that constitute human communities. They need to be integrated into the practices that make community possible. So what I want to emphasize about these contextualized approaches is not just that they're effective at advancing human agency without imposing new structures, potential structures of domination, but they also have in common an internal democratic logic. And this goes to the agent-patient distinction. So I was grateful to Mark because that actually is important here, in which the work of advancing human rights respects and directly engages with the moral and rational agency of those who are most vulnerable within the sites of change. It treats human rights not as commands whose disobedience warrants moral condemnation, but as negotiated practices through which the equal dignity of all participants is affirmed and enhanced. It leaves plenty of space for recognizing that human rights, whether advanced in universalistic language or not, are essentially contested concepts, as W.B. Galley put it, not least because their assertion, by definition, challenges existing structures of social power. So there's no generalizable formula as to how the practical content of human rights should be worked out on the ground. But one thing that is generalizable is that the more inclusive and egalitarian, that is, the more democratic, the process of that contestation, then the greater traction the human rights discourses will have in transforming relationships in the direction of non-domination. So that's the point, that we should need to understand human rights contextually. What about thinking about social justice universally? Why does globalization bring out this possibility? The answer begins with the critique of the contemporary structures of economic globalization that aligns in many ways with the ones we've already discussed, that the current structure systematically privileges already powerful states, and particularly for ordinary people in the global south. So opposition to what's commonly framed as global neoliberal capitalism has generated transnational social movements, or globalization from below, which pushes against the globalization from above that's exemplified by the institutions I already discussed. So one example of this globalization from below, which is quite familiar, is the World Social Forum. And these dynamics of mobilization crystallized and took on a new structural form, I think, beginning in December 2010, when Tunisian fruit vendor Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest desperate economic conditions combined with state brutality. As we all know, his death catalyzed mass protests against the authoritarian regime in Tunisia and spread first to Egypt and then throughout the region, the Arab Spring. In Europe, drawing inspiration from the Arab Spring, protests over the economic crisis in Portugal and then in Spain broke out within a few months of the protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo. Now, the links between these dispersed protests were often very explicit. In Spain, for example, And they all claimed, and all the European protests directly claimed inspiration from the Arab Spring, but then within Europe, so the Spanish protesters, los indignados, the indignant ones, carried signs saying, "Be quiet, the Greeks are sleeping." And then Greek protests erupted very soon after that, with some protesters carrying a banner reading, "We've woken up. What time is it? It's time they left." And others in Greece marched with banners saying, "Be quiet, the French are sleeping." So the contagion of these movements and the conversations between them, facilitated by new social media and the internet, were of course picked up and spread to the US in the fall. Thanks in no small part to the campaign by the Canadian magazine Adbusters. And so Occupy Wall Street began, picking up on the title of a very influential article by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz in Vanity Fair. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do, of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. So he was criticizing the post-subprime crisis and the bank bailouts. And so the protesters picked up on that and proclaimed, "We are the 99%. So they also renamed New York's Zuccotti Park as Freedom Square in honor of the Egyptian and Tunisian protesters. And of course, the movement quickly spread across the US and Canada and around the world. In addition to the repeated cross-referencing of nationally focused, locally organized protests, and the iterated echoes of the rhetorics of protest originating in one site or another, there was also, across these protest movements, a diffusion of techniques, particularly techniques of nonviolent protest. And we've seen the emergence of this bizarre form of communication, the human microphone, which keeps getting replicated in different places as well. So that just shows that these are not isolated events, they are connected. So across them, the themes were strikingly continuous. Demands for democracy, accompanied by characterizations of current regimes, democratic or non-democratic, as kleptocracies, and demands for social justice. Especially in the Occupy movement, the addressees of the protests are, in the first instance, not the state, it's the financial elite. We occupy Wall Street, not Washington. But they're simultaneously directed at the national political system, which is cast as wholly captured by this elite. So the protest of the economic order of power is both in form and in content. Form of the human microphone, the face-to-face gatherings, the content of the need for reforms of the political systems that have been captured by economic and especially financial elites. It's also a claim for the renewal of democracy. Taken together, it seems indisputable that these protests have generated an emergent global discourse of social justice, in which national institutions, financial and corporate elites, and international or global institutions are seen as constituent elements of a single system of political and economic power, which must be rendered democratically accountable to the people whom they so profoundly affect. And this discourse advances an indictment of what they, again, across the movements, call neoliberalism, as both a national and a global structure of economic and political power. In the diffusion of the terms and practices of an alternative form of democracy, the movements also express a new horizontal, networked democratic imaginary, which is all at once local, national, global. An imaginary that doesn't privilege the formal institutions of representative government at the core, as the core of what democracy means. So let's say you're kind of persuaded by that characterization of what's going on. You may not agree with we don't have to affirm it in order to suggest that there is a new emerging global discourse of social justice. But let's say there is some new discourse of social justice and democracy that has a growing capacity to link different scales of politics and accountability. Now that in itself isn't enough to say that social justice is universal. It's just enough to say that it's gone global. And further, doesn't it count against the idea that the term social, or against this interpretation that the term social justice is actually seldom invoked by people, say, in the Occupy movement? In response, I want to suggest that the reason why the term social justice hasn't been invoked so much as an instrument for advancing social justice is that in the current political moment, especially in the American context, that language of social justice has been successfully marginalized because it's been connected equated with socialism and therefore un-American. And so the slogan, "We are the 99%, has proven remarkably resonant as a substitute for this language of social justice. And I think that it's because this idea, "we are the 99%, carries potential as an incipient universalistic view about social justice, one which resonates with the idea expressed by Rawls and others that society is a scheme of cooperation for mutual advantage, and that justice is about creating a society that is of mutual advantage, and that any scheme of cooperation which justifies such skewed outcomes, that was to benefit the 1% so much and not to benefit the 99% very much, is prima facie unjust." And so it doesn't express a positive ideal account of social justice, but rather an emerging consensus on a negative view of justice. Whatever justice is, and we're going to disagree about that, it's not this. And so I think that helps to explain the popularity, the fact that we see this "we are the 99% popping up all over the world, Seoul, and in all the Occupy movements. So we'll see. Who shall be judge whether or not this view of justice will take hold, whether people will agree, whether the current system is unjust. Of course, Locke's answer, "the people shall be judge," raises the question whether the people will stand behind the relatively small minority of citizens who've actually participated in these movements. So will that happen? Who knows? As Deng Xiaoping said when asked about his view of the French Revolution, he said whether the French Revolution was a good thing for humanity, he said, "It's too soon to tell." So in arguing then for the importance, I'm going to try to wrap this up, I'm going on a little bit too long, in this historic moment of globalization, of revisiting the standard view of human rights as universal and social justice as contextual, what I don't mean to suggest is that we should abandon the familiar ways of thinking about the ideals. An order of international law affirming and increasingly enforcing universalistic human rights remains an important instrument for making human rights a practical reality. And it's equally important that we continue efforts to gain recognition for social justice within the national domain, and that we struggle for democracy and redemocratization within that domain. So I don't see these different ways of thinking about the relationship between human rights and universalism, social justice and contextualism as mutually exclusive. I don't think we can afford to think about them as mutually exclusive because both offer us instruments for resisting forms of human disempowerment. So I don't think we need to make an either-or choice. But what I want to suggest here is that actually if we try to think about these simultaneously, what we get, and we think of these lines of connection, the horizontal lines and the diagonal lines, as vectors of action oriented toward realizing human rights and social justice. If we think about it that way, then what we can begin to do is to sketch out a kind of global division of labor, of working toward human rights and social justice. And so I don't think any of these roles is indispensable, but none of us can play all of these roles at the same time. None of us will be inclined, some of us won't be inclined toward one or another form of action. But what we can do is to see that whatever work we're doing in any of these directions, on any of these scales, is part of an overarching system of action, a part of a cooperative scheme, a collaborative scheme of action oriented toward realizing human rights and social justice on local, national, global scales, and that we can see our work as mutually supportive of the efforts that other people are undertaking in different locations in this system. And I think that in doing that, it helps us to orient ourselves toward particular courses of action that we might take without feeling this sense of paralysis that often, I think, comes with our increasing understanding of globalization as creating relationships of interdependence, of interconnection, of our impacts on distant others through our acts of consumption, through the exercise of power of our national governments, and so on. We come to see ourselves as connected to distant people all over the world, and that can sometimes become paralyzing from a sort of agent-centered point of view, because there are so many different demands on us, and it all seems so complicated and so overwhelming that it's hard even to find a place to drive in a wedge. And so I think that trying to understand the different forms of action as parts of an interlocking system and a dynamic system oriented toward human rights and social justice may be a bit helpful. And so what I want to suggest finally in conclusion is just that each of these lines represents a different vector of action oriented toward realizing human rights, social justice through different kinds of political practice and through different kinds of work of social and political practice. So what I've identified as A, human rights activism within existing international law. That still connects human rights and universalism. That's the kind of work we see by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the work going on in the ICC and other tribunals, and is crucially important. The second line B, there was a bit of a glitch in the PowerPoint slide. There should be an arrow going down from human rights to social justice. But that's work aimed at getting a more robust, universal definition of what human rights include, including positive social and economic rights. And so then that connects universalism, human rights, and social justice in a single kind of scheme of action. And here we can locate advocacy not only for recognizing social and economic rights as human rights, but also other kinds of institutional reforms, like reforms of the IMF, the World Bank, international regulatory instruments, and so on. The third vector, C, I'm calling re-democratization and social justice within states. So the work that people are doing to try to revive the welfare state, to bring about tax reform, to correct current structures that privilege economic interests in the political system, such as campaign finance reform, and so on. But I think it also includes developing new forms, new horizontal forms of democratic social action. D, alliances between local, transnational, global, local and transnational or global movements for economic change, links social justice to universalism, as I've suggested. And then the final line is E, connecting human rights to contextualism, and that's the work of those translators that I was talking about. So that's where we can situate work aimed at fostering local deliberations over the practical content of human rights that can be meaningful within a given community. Now, can all these good things, if you agree that they are good things, go together? I think it'd be reckless to suggest that there aren't tensions between them, but as we've already noted, human rights and social justice are essentially contested concepts, and I kind of tend to think that the very practice of contestation over them and the temporary settlements that contestation sometimes generates is actually what gives life and substance and meaning to our normative orders, that we need to be debating these things in order to for them to be meaningful in our lived lives, our daily lives. So as we imagine ourselves as individuals within this larger system, I think it's important to ask ourselves how our actions shape or the distribution of energies and power in the system as a whole. Are our actions complementary to other actors, those of other actors working on behalf of human rights and social justice elsewhere in the system, or is the way we're pursuing our goals potentially at odds with, does it undermine or frustrate the actions of others who are working on the same problems on different scales? I think we can't wholly grasp or predict when our actions are actually going to turn out to be supportive of the efforts that others are making. But seeing ourselves as participants in a global system of human rights and social justice action is, I think, a first step toward taking responsibility for the consequences that we can foresee and that we see unfold. Thank you.